The stars may call to us, but answering that call could mean leaving everything we know behind, perhaps forever. Interstellar travel has long been a dream of humanity, but between us and the stars lies a brutal reality. Space is vast, hostile, and unyielding. Unlike short jaunts to the moon, or even multi-year missions to Mars, an interstellar voyage isn't just a test of technology, it's a test of endurance, adaptation, and survival itself. The cosmos does not care if we make it, but history shows that we never let that stop us before. In past episodes, we've explored the technical feasibility of star travel, from generation ships that carry entire civilizations through the void to sleeper ships that put their passengers into deep hibernation. We've examined the concept of world ships, vast spacefaring megacities that could sustain life for many millennia, and the challenges of interstellar colonization, where humanity must not only reach a distant star, but build a future upon arrival. Each of these approaches presents its own unique challenges. Can we endure the journey itself? Survival in deep space is not just a matter of keeping the air flowing and the engines running. Time and distance will test our bodies, our minds, and even the fabric of our civilization. Can we remain human across generations aboard a ship cut off from Earth? Can our biology endure cosmic radiation, microgravity, and centuries of isolation? Can we keep ourselves together while our spaceship slowly falls apart? Could society collapse before we even arrive? In this episode, we will break down the full scale of the challenge, not just how we might travel between the stars, but whether we can survive the voyage at all. The brutal reality of time and distance. Space is vast in a way that defies intuition. Even the closest star, Proxima Centauri, is over 4 light-years away, 26 trillion miles, 41 trillion kilometers. That means that even with near-future propulsion systems, a journey could take centuries, if not longer. You also have to carry your fuel to slow down on arrival, but that doesn't give you the fuel to turn around and come home. Once you cross that threshold, there is no safety net, no turning back, only forward. That kind of finality changes everything: your past, your future, your very sense of home. You need an insane amount of fuel compared to your ship to get to a star and slow down, but you need 500,000 times more fuel than that if you want to include return trip fuel in the original trip. Unlike the exploratory missions of the past, where a ship could turn back in an emergency, interstellar voyages are a one-way leap into the unknown. The Tyranny of Distance. If we assume an optimistic 10% of light speed, which is orders of magnitude beyond our current capabilities, a trip to Proxima Centauri would still take over 40 years. If we slow that to 1% of light speed, a far more realistic near-term possibility that the Orion Drive might offer, it would take over 400 years. And for more distant stars, there's a few dozen star systems within a dozen light-years of us, more or less one for every 3D direction you might go, and that could thus serve as first stop in a leapfrogging of stellar settlement in a sphere around us. But at 1% of light speed, that means even some of these first stops would take over 1,000 years. Even at a more optimistic 5% light speed, which the Orion Drive might pull off, that means most take a couple hundred years. Beyond that, the timescales quickly reach thousands, even tens of thousands of years. The problem isn't just time, it's the resources required to keep people alive that long. A ship isn't just a vehicle, it's a world, sealed off from everything but the endless dark. A spaceship capable of sustaining generations must be a self-contained ecosystem, capable of recycling air, water, food, and raw materials without fail for centuries. Even a small failure in a vital system could doom the entire crew, making redundancy and sustainability more critical than ever. The energy barrier. Going faster isn't much of a solution either. The faster a ship moves, the more energy it requires, and the numbers get staggering. A 1,000-ton ship traveling at 10% of light speed would need several times the entire world's current annual energy consumption just to accelerate, assuming very optimistic efficiency. Slowing down at the destination requires just as much energy, unless the ship has some way to break against stellar wind or planetary atmospheres. The rocket equation makes this even worse, as you must pay more energy to accelerate your slowdown fuel if you have to carry it with you. Even advanced fusion or antimatter rockets push against the limits of what's physically possible, requiring massive fuel reserves or staged acceleration via beam-powered propulsion. We don't need magic, we need physics, patience, and a plan. This is why so many proposals, like those we discussed in our looks at generation ships, sleeper ships, siege ships, and more, focus on slow travel and sustainability, rather than brute-forcing speed or circumventing the issue by just bringing along tiny self-replicating machines to build everything, and even every body, from stored DNA or digital archives. Until breakthroughs in physics, like warp drives or wormholes, become a reality, which I suspect will be never, we are locked in a trade-off between speed, survival, and sustainability. The time problem. If we ever do reach speeds close to light, we face another challenge: relativity itself. At 50% of light speed, time dilation effects start to become noticeable, and at 87%, a traveler experiences time at less than half the rate of those left behind. While this might seem beneficial, shortening the perceived journey, it also reminds us that any real-time communication with Earth becomes impossible. Even at extreme time dilations, which require insane levels of energy compared to the already enormous amounts of energy for relativistic travel, you cannot shorten the trip from your homeworld's perspective. Travel 100 light-years away and maybe only 1 year passed for you, and one more to get back, by relativity or by cryo-sleep, but would still be 200 years when you get home. Civilizations back home might have moved centuries ahead, changed beyond recognition, or even ceased to exist. Something many sci-fi novels explore, like Joe Haldeman's classic Forever War. From a practical perspective, you need help and tech updates from home, especially in early interstellar settlement efforts. You are not making new science and technology on your own, not on that ship or that colony. And while many problems will be solved faster by your own crew than explained to the folks back home, and waiting many years for a reply, this is not a sci-fi show where your chief engineer or science officer can magically fix any problem or solve some new science in a few hours, or even a few decades. Imagine a naval vessel or pioneer town from the 1800s sending us a message, whether by phone or telegram, and even if it took years to send a reply due to signal lag, we could still deliver some truly remarkable technology and solutions in return. But now imagine that message came from a group we strongly disapproved of, say a slave ship. We might not be so eager to offer them assistance, and from their perspective, the future might disapprove of them just as much. The country that launched their mission might have been overthrown long ago, and they wouldn't even know that Mission Control had sent them off with a flawed engine design, intended to destroy the last remnant of a troublesome civilization already consigned to history. This introduces a psychological challenge as well. How do travelers cope with the knowledge that, even if they survive, they may arrive in a future where their homeworld has forgotten them? Or where they haven't, but the settlers wish they did? The need for a new mindset. Interstellar travel isn't like hopping on a faster plane or sending a robotic probe to another planet. It requires a paradigm shift in how we think about space travel. The journey itself may take generations, need life extension methods, require fundamental transformations of human society, or even demand that we abandon human biology altogether. We have ship options like the Gardner ship or Gardner fleet that doesn't have a destination. It merely stops at systems to refuel and resupply, drop off some of its people to settle the place, and heads off to the next system, breeding more folks during the century-long journey, sometimes building new ships or splinter fleets to continue the mission on a new vector. This requires a civilization to divide itself like an amoeba every few generations, over and over again, likely often separating friends and family forever, something that humanity often endured in the past before telephones and airplanes, but which is rarely the case now. This is why surviving the journey isn't just about technology. It's about adapting to a new way of life, one where the stars are home, not just a destination. In the next section, we'll explore whether our biology can handle such a life, or if we must change ourselves to make the journey possible. Human adaptation. Can we survive physically? If a spaceship is to sustain human life over decades, centuries, or even millennia, it must not only provide air, water, and food, it must also account for the toll that deep space travel takes on the human body. We evolved to live on Earth, bathed in its protective magnetic field, anchored by its gravity, and surrounded by a complex biosphere of bacteria and nutrients. Remove any one of these and problems arise. Remove all of them and humanity may become something else entirely, if it survives at all. Perhaps that's a path we'll embrace, a post-human pathway, but we have a lot of options for avoiding that too, to help us solve the many threats we'll face in space. One of the greatest threats is radiation exposure. Space is filled with cosmic rays, high-energy particles that can shred DNA and lead to cancer, neurological damage, and reproductive issues. Even people on ice are not protected from this, as they still need radiation shielding and can accumulate radiation damage even from the radioisotopes in their own body. Earth's atmosphere and magnetic field shield us from much of this, but a spaceship traveling through interstellar space will be exposed to constant radiation, even a well-shielded vessel, and we are talking at least a meter, if not much more, would need thick layers of water, ice, or specialized materials to provide protection. This is where concepts like fishbowl starships, which use massive water reservoirs as shielding, could come into play. Today we're exploring how we might journey across the vast ocean of darkness between stars, and one option for making that swim is with ships protected by water. In this month's exclusive, we'll explore that intriguing possibility: fishbowl starships. These are vessels that use thick layers of water as radiation shielding, thermal regulation, and even kinetic armor, offering both protection and sustainability for deep space voyages. Fishbowl Starships is available exclusively on Nebula, where I post all my episodes early, ad-free, and with extra content just for subscribers. A Nebula subscription helps support this channel and others like it, and you get perks like guest passes and other great science content from other creators, like the Efficient Engineers look at shaped memory alloys, another material that might help us in space. You can also get discounted lifetime memberships for $300 and unlock my entire archive of early, ad-free episodes, including dozens of SFA exclusives and extended editions like Fishbowl Starships. Prefer something more flexible? You can also subscribe annually for just $36 a year. That's 40% off. Either way, head to go.nebula.tv/IsaacArthur and join us in gazing into our future. Shielding isn't just an engineering concern, it's also a psychological one. Even if a spaceship has what experts deem an objectively safe level of radiation protection, many people will still feel uneasy about it. Anxiety over radiation exposure could become a significant issue, especially for those who don't fully trust the safety margins. While the original crew can be screened for their comfort level with radiation, eliminating anyone with a pathological fear, that doesn't prevent someone from developing that fear later. It also does little to address concerns among children and grandchildren born during that journey. However, if radiation shielding is normalized from birth, with all the adults around them remaining unconcerned, it might help limit those worries. Sleeper ships have some immunity to this since their colonists are all volunteers, except in dystopian prison colony scenarios, who can be screened for radiation concerns before departure. More importantly, they'll be asleep for most if not all of the journey, rather than awake with time to dwell on the risks. Adding to the challenge the fact that there is no truly objective, safe level of radiation, and shielding is one of the heaviest components of a spaceship. While fuel may ultimately outweigh it, every additional layer of shielding increases the total mass, which in turn increases the fuel requirements. Doubling the shielding cuts the radiation in half, but nearly doubles the ship's fuel costs. Triple the shielding and radiation drops to a quarter. Quadruple it, it's down to an eighth. Every extra layer of protection comes at a steep price. While shielding materials may be relatively inexpensive compared to the rest of the ship, and may include its own slowdown fuel and water reserves, they are not free, and the exponential trade-off between mass and protection becomes a key constraint in interstellar mission design. Advancements in radiation protection and cancer treatments can help mitigate exposure risks, but only to a certain extent. Using a non-biological crew, such as AI and robotic systems, offers another solution. but machines, especially intricate and microscopic ones, are also vulnerable to radiation damage. There's a tendency to assume that tiny, automated ships carrying blueprints and a handful of nanobots could colonize the galaxy, and while there's some truth to that, it's only part of the picture. Radiation is particularly damaging to complex and delicate structures, and the smaller they are, the more susceptible they become. To work around this, rather than sending out fragile, self-replicating nanobots to build from scratch at the destination, it makes more sense to launch large, robust ships from the start. With the sheer mass available in the asteroid belt, humanity can easily construct and launch 1 trillion aircraft carrier-sized vessels without significantly depleting resources, making the idea of sending tiny, vulnerable ships far less appealing. Bigger is better. This ties into a fundamental principle of space colonization that we frequently discuss on this show. If you have the ability to build autonomous, self-replicating machines that can construct colonies around distant stars without direct supervision, then you also have the ability to build large-scale infrastructure right here in our own solar system. That means we wouldn't be limited to small, minimalist starships. We could build massive arc ships, space-based refineries, and fuel depots to support large-scale interstellar travel. The larger the vessel, the better its odds of survival across nearly every metric, with the only drawback being the risk of having all your eggs in one basket. There are other advantages to going big, particularly when it comes to shielding. The volume of a ship scales with the cube of its size, while the surface area that needs shielding only increases with the square. This means if you build a ship 10 times larger in each dimension, it will have 100 times the shielding mass, but 1,000 times the internal volume. As a result, it can afford proportionally 10 times more shielding thickness, reducing radiation exposure to just 2,000ths of what it would otherwise be. Once a ship reaches a size where its shielding is thick enough to adequately protect passengers, it becomes more practical to build additional ships rather than continuing to scale up a single vessel. These ships could travel in formation, shuttling between one another cheaply or even connecting via tethers to allow the high bandwidth flow of people, power, and information. This wouldn't necessarily mean a fleet of identical ships either. Instead, you'd likely see a handful of massive, city-like vessels where most people live, supported by a variety of smaller tender ships performing specialized roles. Radiation shielding, like everything else in space, should ideally serve multiple purposes. Hydrogen-rich materials such as water, ammonia, or methane are excellent at blocking radiation, making water an obvious candidate for shielding. Deuterium, a heavier isotope of hydrogen, is even better at the job and also happens to be the primary fuel for fusion-powered spacecraft. This means that a starship's outer shielding is likely to consist of honeycombed or wafered compartments filled with deuterium reserves or water storage. The shielding itself could even be made from components of the light sail used to gain free acceleration from the home system or to slow down at the destination. Once the ship reaches interstellar space, that sail could be repurposed as a protective cocoon around the vessel. Other components, such as miles of hyperstrong cables, might be stored wrapped around the ship and later deployed at the destination to create a space elevator, helping settlers transport goods and people between the surface and orbit. Similarly, vast, flexible mirror arrays could be packed aboard and later deployed in orbit to redirect sunlight onto power collectors or warm up landing sites on colder planets. A key concept in space travel is that when mass is the primary bottleneck, every component must be dual-purpose or recyclable. This principle won't just apply to engineering, it will shape the mindset of the crew as well. Over the course of a multi-century journey, this necessity for efficiency and adaptability will likely have profound cultural impacts, shaping the civilization that develops on board in ways we can only begin to imagine. Radiation is a big health worry from a physical perspective. The psychological problems are probably bigger, and you can see our episode Staying Sane in Space for a reminder just how rough the mental health landscape is just in low orbit, a quick telephone or Zoom call from help and family and friends. Many of these problems are likely to have solutions that mitigate them, but do not eliminate them. There are other physiological concerns, of course. Microgravity poses another severe challenge, but we tend to assume our arc ships have large rotating habitation drums in them, and these can be very natural environments if you have fusion reactors because it turns out that running the lights inside a big O'Neill cylinder for several centuries of daylight still takes way less power than accelerating that spaceship up to interstellar speeds. You can also have quite a lot of thick dirt and water in your landscape, since the floor is the outside of the ship, and you need a couple meters of dirt and water to provide sufficient radiation shielding, if not more. So great big natural habitats really are viable, and a ship can have several separate drums in a long line to allow separate environments for redundancy or environmental variety. Or multiple ships. Interstellar ships generally benefit from being long and skinny, as it requires less forward shielding, which is where most of your impacts and much of your radiation come from. So you could have kilometer-wide habitation drums strung out behind a ship like railroad train cars. I don't think a low-gravity environment, let alone microgravity, would be the goal for these ships, though they would still have large sections without artificial gravity. Tender vessels in a fleet might operate in microgravity, docking with the main ships to switch crews every few weeks or even every shift. Rather than a single massive spinning cylinder or ring, a more likely design would involve a larger superstructure with multiple rotating habitats installed inside. This would allow for areas with full gravity while also maintaining less shielded sections with little or no gravity, likely used for storage, manufacturing, and maintenance. Or even food production. Most of the habitation drum would likely be dedicated to living spaces and carefully maintained ecosystems intended for eventual transplant at new colonies. Instead of creating a prairie where natural grasslands could sustain thousands of grazing animals, the approach would be more like a well-managed zoo, where most of the food supply comes from large-scale hydroponic farms housed within the ship's superstructure. These farms, being more radiation-resistant than biological passengers, could be positioned in less shielded areas. Since cancer is not contagious and plants don't seem to require much gravity, it's likely that slow-rotating, low-gravity hydroponic chambers would be used to grow the bulk of the food supply, both for humans and larger livestock. This setup would maximize efficiency while minimizing space and shielding requirements, ensuring a stable and sustainable food source for the journey. A lot of this might be automated by basic AI or remote-controlled drones, but crew members would still venture into these areas as needed, with some sections pressurized for easier access and others remaining in vacuum. From a science fiction perspective, one could imagine an enormous ship, larger than a modern metropolis, where vast portions of the non-rotating superstructure remained habitable. Over time, this could give rise to an entire subculture of exiles and criminals, people pushed out of the main colony, surviving the ship's unregulated microgravity slums. Over generations, they might even develop their own mutant civilization, adapted to life without gravity, forever orbiting within the massive framework of their generational starship. Even if we solve the physical risks of interstellar travel, there is another looming threat: ourselves. How does a civilization cope with the crushing isolation of deep space? Can humans remain sane on a ship where generations may never see a planet? Or will interstellar voyagers rebel, stagnate, or even forget their mission entirely? In the next section, we'll explore the psychological and societal struggles of living in a world that never stops moving. Settler ships or colonial countries. We were talking about mutant civilizations arising on the fringe of the colony ship, and this returns to scale. These ships are likely to be huge. Let's walk through a hypothetical example. It's the year 3025, and the human population in the solar system has risen to about 100 trillion, a lot of which live on or in orbit of Earth, or in space habitats embedded in asteroids we mine. That's about 12,000 times the current human population, and assumes it doubles every century. Relatively slow growth, especially for a population that probably has life extension technologies. They like the population number just where it is. And so they ship out the surplus on spaceships that are mostly made by robots. The cost for these endeavors is paid for on the back end by having the colonists ship home 100 times the raw materials used to build and fuel the ship. These ships tend to mass around 1 trillion tons, fuel and all, which means the settlers owe Earth the equivalent of one small asteroid, for which they have tens of thousands, and a bunch of deuterium, drawn from the mind-bogglingly bigger supply inside any gas giant in their new star systems. Every star within 100 light-years is either already settled or has a colony fleet en route, and many ships are sent to these anyway, with millions of settlers on ice inside them. But they ship out around 100 billion awake people to new colonies every year in giant arc fleets, dispatching around 1,000 such expeditions a year. They won't fill the galaxy up very fast either. You would need to dispatch 1,000 fleets a year for a few 100 million years to do that. But at this time, ships average 10% light speed for their journeys and have about an 1,100-year journey time to one of the roughly 12,000 star systems between 100 and 120 light-years from Earth. It will take 12 years to get missions out to each of those systems at this rate, 1,000 fleets a year, and they will arrive sometime in the 41st to 43rd century. That means 100 million people per fleet. That is a country, not a small one either, and while they could live off way less land than we have per capita these days, they probably also want a lot for growth en route and for sustaining ecosystems. You can grow a lot of people in 1,100 years, so much so that you probably need birth control rules and policies for having people go on ice if the numbers get too big. Thankfully, keeping people frozen in space is not too hard. This obviously isn't your first wave of ships out to Alpha Centauri or Tau Ceti either. We've looked at bare-bones early missions like those before, but don't think of this as late-stage galactic colonization either. This really is the early days, when only our star system can send out colony ships, and when even our most distant automated probes have yet to examine a tiny fraction of the galaxy. How big is a ship in this fleet? If we imagine 1 million people living in an O'Neill cylinder designed for dense habitation, and the fleet includes 4 additional cylinders for each one of those, dedicated to non-urban housing, future expansion, and nature preserves, that gives us 500 O'Neill cylinders, an effective land area roughly equal to England. Most of the larger ships likely house multiple such cylinders within their superstructures, ready to be deployed as standalone space habitats upon arrival. Beyond that, the superstructure themselves would contain vast storage areas, factories, and hydroponic farms, forming what is effectively an archipelago of enclosed spaces, rather than a single continuous landmass. It is easy to imagine a fleet of 12 massive ships, each accompanied by 100 smaller vessels and an almost countless number of smaller towns and subcultures emerging within their sprawling interiors. A town of 10,000 people might exist solely to maintain a reactor that most of the fleet doesn't even know the name of, complete with its own schools, shops, and Little League teams. Or if we lean into the sci-fi angle, that same reactor might be home to a fanatical mutant cult, worshipping its power source while engaging in territorial conflicts with neighboring sections over access to spare parts. Indeed, for voyages of 1,000 years, that cheerful nameless town might later become the one full of crazed mutant cultists as the centuries swam by. Given such a long journey, it's easy to imagine the ship experiencing breakdowns, gradual wear and tear, or entire sections being damaged, whether from accidents, resource shortages, or the inevitable civil wars that might erupt over the centuries. Parts of the fleet could splinter off, either due to ideological differences or necessity, choosing to settle a different star system along the way rather than continuing to the original destination. Over time, what began as a single expedition could fragment into multiple independent civilizations, each with its own evolving culture and history. Solutions to survive. Once again, we need to be mindful that bigger ships often provide solutions to big problems, like sufficient shielding or concerns about genetic bottlenecking and carrying ecosystems along. Obviously, a ship twice as big costs twice as much. But in context, when your goal is to send more people because your main objective is a long-term way of handling surplus populations while growing, this extra cost simply scales with that effort. This isn't a one-time prestige effort to plant a flag on some rock around Alpha Centauri. Technology also offers plenty of solutions, many of which we've explored in other episodes on this show. DNA can be frozen and stored in well-shielded cryovaults, or even digitally encoded for later printing, allowing populations and ecosystems to be refreshed if necessary. Digital DNA could even be transmitted from Earth, providing a wider genetic pool or replacing anything lost. In terms of society, Larger ships provide far more space to explore, reducing feelings of confinement. Colonists would have access to the entire digital archive of human history, every book, movie, and game ever created, along with real-time updates from Earth. Virtual reality offers not just entertainment, but an interactive platform for planning the future colony, keeping settlers engaged and informed as new intel and methods arrive. Even fears of them losing attachment to Earth and humanity can be mitigated by lots of history and fictional shows set on Earth, so it feels real and not some place they fled long ago. Fusion power, if perfected, would provide ultra-cheap, abundant energy, allowing ships to operate for millennia on a fraction of the fuel needed for initial acceleration. But even nuclear fission, combined with Orion drives and breeder reactors, could enable interstellar colonization, albeit at a slower pace and with more modest accommodations. Fleets could send out fast automated Vanguard probes to establish basic infrastructure at the destination system, including power beaming arrays to assist in braking without fuel. Some ships might detach from the fleet to land on rogue planets in interstellar space, set up mining operations, mass drivers, fusion reactors, and pushing arrays to refuel the fleet before catching up later. We are planning journeys that won't just take centuries, they won't even begin for centuries, and yet even with today's science, a clear technological pathway exists. If interstellar fleets launch from Earth a few hundred years from now, they will likely be as advanced beyond us as we are compared to the great exploratory and colonial fleets of the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries. History is clear. What once seemed impossible has a habit of becoming inevitable. Final thoughts. Can we survive the journey? The idea of interstellar travel is often framed as a question of technology. Can we build the engines, the habitats, and the ships to carry us across the void? But in reality, it's a question of who we are and who we might become. The journey won't just be a challenge of propulsion or engineering, it will test our ability to endure isolation, to adapt to new ways of life, and to carry forward the ideals of civilization through centuries of uncertainty. We've seen that the distances are daunting, the energy requirements staggering, and the biological challenges severe. A ship must sustain its people across centuries, shielding them from radiation, keeping ecosystems in balance, and ensuring that the culture they bring with them can withstand the pressures of an enclosed, ever-moving world. There will be social conflicts, breakaway factions, lost ships, and entire generations who will live and die without ever seeing the stars they were promised. But perhaps this is exactly what we need to prepare for the stars. Interstellar travel won't be a single great leap. It will be a process of expansion, fragmentation, and reinvention, just as we've seen throughout human history. Whether it takes 1,000 years or 1,000,000, whether our descendants are biological, digital, or something else entirely, humanity's journey across the cosmos will likely mirror the way life spreads across Earth. Slowly at first, filled with setbacks, but ultimately unstoppable. The real question isn't just whether we can survive the journey, it's whether we can build a future where such journeys are not just possible, but inevitable. And if history is any guide, we will.